my premise is that war has an unchanging nature, but all the same has a highly variable character. And we find ourselves in one of those phases in history where these issues are coming to the fore with a lot of urgency, and therefore we certainly need to address these points along the lines discussed by my co-panelist or along other lines, but the issues are before us and they're unavoidable. And so looking at the scenery of armed conflict as it is characterized today, a number of questions arise. What is the value of the statement that war between states has been historically superseded, at least partially or temporarily? What is new, if anything, about new wars? What are the implications of these novelties? Have the earlier configurations fully disappeared? Is this merely a phase or a full paradigmatic shift? Is indeed such destitution of the state conceivable, meaningful, sustainable under the arrangement of international law? And finally, since most wars today tend to feature more a sense of disintegration of states rather than a formation of states, as we saw in the 60s, what implications can we draw from these questions? To answer these questions at the outset, and so as not to bury the lead of my presentation, I will say that conflict today is characterized primarily by the steady, though not full, emergence of a new paradigm, defined mostly by a three-pronged phenomenon. First, the privatization and autonomization of the use of force. We see this in the context of armed groups, but it's playing out fully on the spectrum all the way up to and including private military contractors. Secondly, the diminishing, not the disappearance, but the diminishing of intrastate war and the related destatization playing along that continuum as well. And finally, the appearance of new patterns of intermediary status of war between international armed conflict and non-international armed conflict, specifically of a transnational nature between armed groups and states. In his celebrated book on war, Karl von Clausewitz wrote that war had a grammar of its own. And so, in that sense, the emerging vocabulary that we're seeing before us features infrastate agents playing themselves across boundaries and interjecting themselves into that symmetrical Westphalian equilibrium between states. Consequently, and more importantly, military affairs appear to no longer be the sole province of the states. Now, admittedly, that was never fully the case, and how can it be indeed with a situation such as war that plays out in ways that are so uncontrollable? But over the past centuries or so, we've seen an evolution whereby a classical paradigm is gradually taken over by a new grammar. Traditionally, war was resting on a paradigm built around the function of soldiery. War took place between soldiers as representatives of the states. War took place between states who enjoyed the Weberian monopoly of violence. And those states were in a relationship where the soldiers were the representatives, and gradually we saw the vesting of that grammar into what emerged as IHL. Such arrangement allowed for a certain linear projection of conflict with a certain level of predictability. But of course, only if war were a hermetically sealed phenomenon of human behavior would it not change. To say that war has not changed is to say that the world hasn't. And in fact, and contrary to widespread belief on the role of technology, though of course it is important, the traditional factors of evolution of war have tended to be social, economic, and sometimes even cultural, political for sure. And so roughly from the time of what Frederick Kagan calls the end of the old order in his examination of the Napoleonic Wars of the early 18th century to the 21st century, we've seen war evolve through roughly 4 ages. Now, these are rough categories. They didn't play out in specific phases of time as such, but we have evolved from these 4 ages in a way that the aim in war was to focus on massed manpower, your soldiers marching shoulder to shoulder to meet battle, and focusing on the destruction of the enemy's close force, to a period of massed firepower, think of World War I and the long engagement on both fronts, Eastern and Western, to a period of destruction of the enemy's command and control, which called for a lot of mobility, and the rise of the different divisions, different armies during World War II was a testimony to that, to finally a 4th generation of today in which the notion of network warfare, network-centric warfare, and specifically the destruction of the enemy's command and ability to function as such has become key. Should of course note that this evolution was transformative and evolutionary rather than revolutionary. And so at any given time, you had part of a paradigm playing while the other one was emerging. Think, for instance, of the notion of complexity, which was mentioned earlier, indeed, in the speech by Her Royal Highness. Complexity in battle is increasingly a phenomenon, characteristics of this age. Privatization, we mentioned. Politicization. Interestingly, in the recently released U.S. Army updated field manual on counterinsurgency, it is noted that legitimacy is the main objective and that political factors have primacy. You wouldn't necessarily have had that type of discourse, say, 30, 40 years ago in French counterinsurgency manual against the FLN in Algeria. You'd had much more terror-oriented language, as of course is still in play in the war on terror, but you have increasingly a recognition that to tackle those kind of questions, you need to play out those elements. Those are elements that go beyond the question of the law, of course. But in this new paradigm, they're increasingly coming, and in some cases coming back to the fore. Again, any decent student of history will tell you that we should not expect any full novelty. Politicization was a factor in the battles among the princes. Complexity has always featured in these battles, but it's the sum total and the congregation of all of these factors that had led us into this new age. Another one is the notion of space and time, which is increasingly changing. And we have seen, for instance, an acceleration and deceleration at times of conflict, which was not necessarily the case before. Traditionally, for states, and this should not necessarily surprise us because it correlates with the notion of destatization, states have looked for ways to conduct battle swiftly. So from the age, say, of the 1863 Lieber Code, which speaks of sharp, brief wars pursued vigorously, to the German doctrine of Blitzkrieg, to the more recent notion of shock and awe conducted by the United States in Iraq and even in Afghanistan, armies are always interested in brevity, which is not necessarily the case for the groups that fight them. And in that respect, the drawn-out, deteriorating type of wars that we have seen in recent years speaks a lot to the central role played by the non-state actors. And this emerging paradigm, of course, asymmetry has been mentioned. Asymmetry, which we should really take the time to understand scientifically as merely the absence of a common basis of comparison in relation to a capability. And we've seen this condition instrumentalized by particular groups as a positive factor, whereas technically they're in a weaker position. A strategy which pits their agility and their ability versus the might that they're facing, where the criterion of success is qualitative rather than quantitative, and where the disruption and paralysis of the enemy is more central and more important to offsetting him rather than outpacing him, which is what the armies traditionally, again, are interested in. I say traditionally because in many armies we're seeing recognition of that factor. Think about how the US Army conducted the successful war in Afghanistan. They behaved in many ways like the type of enemies that they were fighting, with agility, with a penetration, with a different type of behavior than the one they adopted in other settings. Here, and to address the topic of the day centrally, we've seen as well a new type of particular challenge for human dignity, a certain return to barbarity in places, an erosion of the stigma traditionally associated with targeting civilians. We've seen it in places like Iraq, of course, with your Abu Ghraib on one side and your beheadings on the other, but also the spate of cases in Haditha, Mahmoudiyya, etc., reveal, as some US prosecutors noted, a worrisome trend within some military to accept high level of civilian casualties as a normal, acceptable element during operations. All of these elements that I mentioned, characteristics of the fourth generation war, which of course characterizes the situation with Al-Qaeda, which played out in a variety of different emerging ways in the 90s, in some conflicts in sub-Saharan Africa, which we've seen, of course, in Afghanistan and other places, culminated just a year and a half ago in the Sixth Arab-Israeli War, which took place between the State of Israel and the non-state armed group of Hezbollah.